Hello, friends. Welcome back to Maple Bay Potager. My name is Faye, and today I'm going to be taking you back in time 2 weeks ago to when I potted up my peppers. And I'm going to show you how I pot up my soil blocks into newspaper pots. So come along and I will show you how I do that. So we are outside on the deck making some newspaper pots. You don't need a lot of supplies to do this. I have some flyers here. And if they're too wide, you can either fold them or rip them in half. These ones are the perfect size, so I'm not going to do anything to them. I have a pint-size mason jar. So I'm making pint-size pots, but you can make them any size you want. And I'm just going to roll my newspaper around the pot and then fold over the bottom. And now we have a pot we can plant in. So I have my bucket of soil here beside me with a little trowel. I'm going to put a little bit of soil in the bottom. Here are our pepper starts that we are potting up. Can you believe that those huge plants can grow in just a soil block? This is our first one. And I plant my peppers deep like tomatoes. They will grow roots up the stem. That is controversial, but I have seen it happen. Here's a couple examples of my peppers growing roots up their stalks. So I do plant mine nice and deep. People will tell you that peppers won't grow roots up their stems, but they do. And now I'm just going to fill this up till it has what I think is enough soil. I'm being pretty conservative with my soil because I'm running out. But this will be plenty for these plants until they go in the ground, which will probably be middle of June, so a month from when we're potting them up here. And there you have it. Newspaper pot. Don't forget to label. I just use a permanent marker to write on the newspaper. They're also very easy to label. So I have been making newspaper pots since I think the first year that I started my own seeds inside, which I think was like 2017. So gosh, almost 10 years ago. And I really haven't had any problems. Some people I've talked to have had issues with mold, and maybe they live in more humid areas than I do. It's pretty dry where I live as a rule. I haven't run into that issue, and I'm kind of a chronic overwaterer, so I feel like if they were gonna mold, I would be probably the candidate that would experience that, and I have not. I really can't think of any complaints that I have other than we don't get newspapers delivered anymore. That's not a thing. So I have to find sources for my newspapers. Thankfully, I have friends who are gracious enough to give me their old newspapers. And I'm very thankful for that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have newspapers, but initially, 10 years ago, when I started doing this, newspapers were a waste product. I have never really been a person to read the newspaper or look at the flyers, and so they either would go in the compost bin or become pots. And so it was nice to have something that was free and readily available. That has changed a little bit since I began doing this years ago, but like I say, thankfully I still have a source. Here's the roots in our soil block, looking great. And these plants 2 weeks later, I'll show you an update at the end of our video here, but I can't believe how much they've grown in 2 weeks. They're huge. They're getting ready to get planted out. So another thing that I really like about newspaper pots is that you can make them whatever size you want. So you could make them bigger than this, you could make them smaller than this, taller, shorter, fatter, skinnier, whatever you need. I also like that they're very flexible and I can kind of squish them all in together into whatever tray I'm using. They're really easy to bottom water. They uptake the water really, really well. I find even if you water them from the top or leave them out in the rain, like they do stay together better than I think people expect them to. Yeah, I really don't have any complaints other than it's getting harder and harder to source newspapers. If you don't have access to newspaper, you could still do this with like brown packing paper. I have seen people use that before. If you have an excess of that, if you get a lot of packages, that could be a good use for it. And then, some people say that they just plant the whole newspaper pot into the ground when they plant these out into the garden. That's not what I do. I just worry that the roots might not make their way out, and maybe that's silly because even when you go to plant them out into the garden, the roots are coming out of the pot. But I prefer to remove the pot, so when I go to plant these out into the garden, will water them really, really well. I find that it's easier to get all the roots gently out of the pot if the newspaper is wet. So I'll water these really good, and then I will just peel the newspaper off and just plant the plant into the ground. And then I will compost all of these little newspaper pots once the plants go into the garden. So really, really easy, really straightforward. I feel like anybody can do this. And I have had plants in these pots for months before at a time, and they hold up really, really well. I am a big fan of newspaper pots. I also like that they are not plastic. They're not they are a single use, but they're not a single use plastic. So even though they are disposable, you're using a waste product and reusing it, giving it a new life before it is ultimately going into the compost bin, because it is still a compostable product. Some people might not be comfortable using this method. I have heard people talk about the potential issue of forever chemicals in the paper that they print newspaper on. As well as I have heard some people be uncomfortable with the potential use of chemicals in the ink that is printed on newspaper. Personally, when I have looked into this, from my understanding, there are regulations in most areas that the ink used in newspapers is just a vegetable ink and it is compostable. It's required to be in a lot of areas. There are laws. The newspapers themselves are often printed on recycled paper, and there are going to be chemicals in that. I do this anyways. I think it's like, do what you're comfortable with. To me, obviously that's not ideal, and I would prefer that there wasn't those chemicals present. But in my mind, whether I am composting this newspaper in my backyard or it is going to a landfill, those chemicals are still breaking down and they are still affecting this planet. And that is still affecting all of us ultimately. So I feel like it's just one of those things. And there you have it. A full tray of peppers all potted up and looking great. And so here is everything after we finished potting up. I think I have 70 some peppers this year. So it has been a couple of weeks since we made these pots, and one of the questions that I get a lot is like, don't they fall apart? How do they stay together? So I don't know if you can see, but this one's a little bit wet on the bottom, a little bit dry on the top. Our plant is looking excellent, and our pot is holding up nicely. And here are the plants almost 2 weeks later. They don't really fit under the lights anymore, and it's time to be hardening them off to get them planted out in the next couple of weeks once everything is warm enough outside. So that's how I make my newspaper pots, and I hope that you found that helpful. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. Bye.